Hello, everyone. Good to be with you once again. Today, I have with me a distinguished scholar, Professor Raghubendra Jha, Professor of Economics at Australia's top university, Australian National University, now retired from there, an emeritus professor. He has taught at many universities in several countries, including India, a real scholar, dozens of books, dozens of articles, words of wisdom. So I'm going to turn it over to him. But before I do that, I want to let you know that at the end, I will ask him to tell us what is it about the Indian economy that he now finds interesting, exciting, negative, or positive. So over to you, Professor Jha.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Subodh Mathur. It is a real pleasure to be with you and all the guests who are attending this video op-ed session. I will talk today about the emerging economic emergency in developing countries. Okay, this is a very serious problem, and unfortunately, it is not getting as much attention as it should be. So let me just begin by saying that the global economy today faces the specter of three expanding crises. These are all expanding. There's a huge burden of debt, public and private, repeated extreme weather events and other tragedies consequent upon climate change, to which the world can now only adapt and not reduce, and lingering public health and economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. These crises have now become full-blown emergencies.
Okay, Professor, let me stop you there for a minute because I want to explain to the viewers your second point. When we talk about climate change, there's a lot of discussion of wind and solar and progress in this generation and that generation. That is what we call as mitigation or reduction. But what Professor is talking about is adaptation, that look, it's going to happen. And we better get used to the idea that it will happen and we better adapt to it. It's a very important idea that I want to bring to the attention of the viewers. There's not much talk about it. I myself am thinking of writing something about it. So I'm glad you brought it up because I want the viewers to understand that, look, especially the young people, that look, it's too late, okay? The adults have betrayed you. We are going to bequeath you with climate change. Thank you so much. You can say to us, you better get ready to adapt to it. So sorry for the interruption, Professor, but let's continue.
So you will say that, not I.
Okay.
In the regular session.
No, I'm done. We are recording now. It's all on.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So these crises have now become full-blown emergencies, particularly for the less developed countries. It is clear that concerted effort at the global level is required to address these challenges. So let me explain each of these problems in minor detail. Well, if you consider the first problem, the debt problem, well before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, levels of debt, both public and private, were building up all over the world. This was partly a legacy of the global financial crisis, but at least the interest rates were low then. So servicing the debt was not so much of a problem. Part of this was the consequence of the recovery effort from the global financial crisis, which had involved the massive provision of fiscal stimuli. However, in response to the low inflation during this period, interest rates were low and the debt appeared manageable.
Okay, Professor, I thought you had some slides you wanted to show. Do you want to share your screen?
The other slide. Oh, sorry, I didn't share it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me go back.
Forgetful Professor.
Yes, okay.
He has prepared the slides, but he's forgotten to share the screen. So please.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Please share your screen so that people understand.
I'm going to start all over again.
Okay, fine. Please share the screen and start again. It takes us adults some time how to turn these things on and off.
Yeah,
so bear with us, okay?
Just a minute. Again, and then
Yeah, please start. We're going to go through it from the beginning.
okay. All right. So the topic of my talk today is the emerging economic emergency in developing countries, and I am delighted to welcome to this talk Professor Subodh Mathur and all the other participants in this video op-ed session. The global economy today faces a specter of three expanding crises: a huge burden of debt, public and private, repeated extreme weather events and other tragedies consequent upon climate change, to which the world can now only adapt and not reduce. This means that the climate change catastrophe is upon us, and we have to try to adapt to it. It is very difficult to reduce or eliminate the risks from climate change. And the third one is lingering public health and economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. These crises have now become full-blown emergencies, particularly for the less developed countries. It is clear that concerted effort at the global level is required to address these challenges.
Okay.
So let's look at the first problem, the debt problem. Well before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, levels of debt, both public and private, were building up all over the world. Part of this was the consequence of the recovery effort from the global financial crisis of 2008-9, which had involved a massive provision of fiscal stimuli in many countries of the world. However, in response to the low inflation during this period, interest rates were low and the debt appeared manageable. However, the pandemic, beginning in 2020, represented a dual public health and economic crisis, with each crisis feeding on the other. Each crisis feeding on the other. That is a very critical aspect of the pandemic. Let's look at the examples of the debt crisis. Recent World Bank data shows that external debt alone of low and middle income countries totaled $9 trillion US dollars at the end of 2021, which is an astounding amount. Rising interest rates increase the risks to global growth and induce debt distress. So let's look at a simple rule of thumb. If the growth rate of the economy is larger than the rate of interest, then the economy is growing fast enough to repay its debt and pay off the interest. But if the rate of interest is larger than the rate of growth, a very simple rule of thumb, okay, then debt is accumulating at a faster rate than the economy is growing. Okay. And therefore, the debt problems will only get compounded, not ameliorated over time. So the World Bank data shows that about 60% of the poorest countries in the world are at high risk of debt distress or already in distress. Hence, these countries need urgent debt relief to tide over this exigency if they are to tide over the immense challenges thrown at them by the COVID-19 pandemic. In South Asia alone, for example, we take some examples. Sri Lanka and Pakistan have had tremendous difficulties in garnering loans from the IMF and other potential lenders. In fact, as many of you would know, both Sri Lanka and Pakistan have experienced civil unrest, fighting in the streets and arson and so on and so forth, partly as a consequence of the debt crisis that they are facing, and the governments are unable to service these loans. Bangladesh has also taken out a big loan from the IMF. So this is South Asia alone. If you look at Africa, if you look at the Pacific Islands, parts of Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America, you have these problems being repeated over and over again. Many developing countries, this is a very serious point, many developing countries have entered into a debt equity swap with their lenders, whereby these countries have agreed to let their creditors acquire equity share in public sector assets in case loans are not paid. So this is like a surreptitious form of neocolonialism that is coming into some parts of the developing world. So the bottom line is urgent funding is needed to help the developing countries tide over their debt problems. Now let's look at the second problem, climate crisis. It has become clear that avoiding climate change is now no longer possible, and adaptation to climate change is the only option available for humanity. So, as has been mentioned by Professor Mathur and others, the older generation has let the future generations down. Let us accept this hard fact. There is no escaping from it, and therefore the future generations can only adapt to climate change. They cannot reduce it. Adaptation to climate change requires huge amounts of funds in the next few years to build the financial and technological capacity to combat perilous consequences of climate change. The UN has estimated that as much as 160 billion US dollars to 340 billion dollars are needed for vulnerable nations, example, the Pacific Islands, by the end of the decade to combat climate change, and up to $565 billion by 2050. These are mind-boggling amounts of money. Okay, now let's look at the third problem. The COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the dire necessity of creating a separate fund to tackle issues of health security to deal with the current COVID-19 pandemic crisis and prepare for the next one. Just to go back to the initial comment about the COVID-19 pandemic, it is an economic crisis as well as a public health crisis, and one crisis feeds into the other. If you want to solve the economic crisis, you would like people to come out and work, factories to be running, enterprises to be running, businesses to be humming. But if you do that, you spread the virus, and there's a huge public health challenge. And if you address the public health challenge, that is, you impose lockdowns and similar things, then you have a huge economic problem because factories are not running, businesses are not humming, and there's a real crisis. So to tide over some of these issues, the world needs a separate global health fund. So if you can have that, then that would help prepare the world for preemptive action among heightened interest in creating separate institutions dedicated to health security as a way of both addressing the current pandemic and preparing for the next outbreak of epidemics. We were unaware that I remember that as far away as 2006, there had been some mention in the press that we were overdue for a global pandemic. Nobody took it very seriously then, but when the pandemic struck in 2020, we were all caught off guard, and there were very serious consequences for the whole world. both public health consequences as well as economic consequences from which we are still trying to recover. Most countries are still trying to recover from that. So we need to prepare. So not everybody is quite prepared to believe that we may have another pandemic or another big epidemic in the near future. But even if we don't, if all goes well, and even if we don't, we can always, it won't hurt to have a global health security fund so that we always remain prepared for a crisis. So, so these are three pressing problems for which we need lots and lots of money at the global level. So the question that is being asked here is, why do we need global sources? Why not bilateral sources or private sources or some such thing? Well, the first reason for that is that rich countries' debt positions are already overstretched. You can't rely on rich countries to provide bilateral aid. Some of them, for example, Japan, have debt GDP ratios in excess of 200%. So it's not 2000, that's a typo, it's 200%. Have debt GDP ratios in excess of 200%. There are many problems of bilateral aid. People who are aware of the aid situation would know that bilateral aid has many problems. For example, tying is just one of them. So a key problem that we notice here is that over time, more and more problems are becoming global, or at least supranational, that is beyond the national boundary, but policy making is confined largely to the nation state. So what I'm going to do now is to talk about two recent suggestions. One not so recent and one is quite recent. Two recent suggestions for global revenue for international development. One is a currency transactions tax, a CTT, or a Tobin tax. Now, this is named after the famous Yale economist James Tobin, who was a Nobel laureate and is well known to all economists all over the world. But Tobin actually did not advocate the use of this tax for getting international resources. What he said was that the currency, the stock market and the currency markets are really too volatile, very volatile. So you should, and that leads to repercussions for the real economy. So what you should do is to slow down the pace of stock market turnovers, currency market turnover. So the very telling phrase he used was to throw sand in the wheels of international finance. If you throw sand into wheels, then the wheels the sand causes friction and the wheels slow down. So that was his idea, but it has been picked up by people who are working in the area of global resources for international development. So a CTT of just 0.1%, it has been calculated by the European Union, no less, would raise over $50 billion a year in revenue. Even assuming that the number of current foreign exchange transactions fell by half in response to the imposition of the tax, that 20% were exempt, and another 20% of the tax was exempted. This is more than double the amount currently spent on stabilization programs and peacekeeping operations. There is a substantial source of revenue. So it's not hopeless, the substantial source of revenue from this. A second suggestion for raising revenue for international aid or international development is the carbon taxation. That carbon emissions have already created a climate emergency in the whole world is merely stating the obvious. Carbon taxation has now been adopted by several countries in the world as a means of slowing down the global economy's march towards higher temperatures and attendant problems. The global total carbon tax revenue potential is projected to be $436 billion by 2030. Some of this could be used for international aid to the least developed countries. So, I've just talked about two such sources of revenue. There are other sources of garnering revenue. At least 19 other ways of collecting revenue from international sources have been suggested in the literature. These include taxation of international arms trade, a surcharge on the highest income tax bracket in the country, parking charges for international satellites, charges for dumping in the deep seas, etc. Many such sources of revenue exist. An essential characteristic of each of these measures is that each such measure has an associated external benefit. For example, if you levy a charge for dumping in the deep seas, then you are basically pricing, which is something which is now a free resource, which is the high seas. But the high seas is basically not being priced because the market mechanism has no way of pricing it. So this is one way of trying to get around that huge problem. A carbon tax obviously is pushing or coaxing the world to move towards a lower carbon trajectory. So each such measure, apart from raising revenue for development, has an attendant external benefit. So this is why such measures are potentially useful for the world economy to consider. There's one caveat, though, which I should mention, which is the issue of Dutch disease. Now, Dutch disease is a phenomenon that arises typically in countries with large amounts of natural resources. So when they export these natural resources, and these natural resources, particularly petroleum and so on, when these are in great demand by the rest of the world, then what happens is that a lot of dollars or external currencies pour into this economy. So as a consequence, this economy's currency appreciates. So if this economy's currency appreciates, then this economy's exports to the rest of the world, particularly manufacturing exports, suffer. This has been happening over and over again. It has happened in many countries, not just in developing countries, but even in Australia, for example, which exports a lot of minerals and therefore gets in a lot of foreign exchange, which leads to an overvaluation of its currency. So that means that so far as possible, the aid, all this aid or some of this aid should be delivered in kind rather than in currency. So these are issues of detail which need to be worked out if there is some movement towards establishing such sources or cementing such sources for funding international aid. Now, there are other problems. For example, the problem of organizing the taxation of deciding how to disburse the amount collected to various countries and so on, which I'm not touching upon here, but there's a good literature on that as well. So I will stop there if you are okay, Professor Mathur. And I will talk about one thing that excites me most about the Indian economy.
Great, let's have it.
Shall we do that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. The thing that excites me most about the Indian economy in recent times is the establishment of the Goods and Services Tax, the GST. The GST, the Indian economy had a very very strong stipulation that commodity taxes could only be levied by the state governments, whereas income taxes, corporate taxes, import duties, and so on could be levied by the central government. So the fact that and of course that meant that one state levied one tax on one commodity, and when it went to another state, it levied its own tax. A lot of cascading. So the Indian commodity tax system was thought of in very well-known area by very well-known economists as the most archaic in the world. Not just a archaic tax system, but the most archaic in the world. But on 1st July 2017, the 101st amendment to the Indian Constitution was undertaken, and which allowed for co-occupation of the same tax base, namely the commodity and services tax base, by both the central and state governments, which has, despite some teething problems and of course the devastation caused by the pandemic, has had a reasonable record, and it has also led to, or is leading, I shouldn't say it has already led, the process is incomplete right now, is also leading to the establishment of a completely unified market in India, which is going to be a big asset to the economy. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Many words of wisdom here for us to understand and follow. And thank you for this last piece of your idea that the GST is actually GST supported by most economists. There have been practical problems, but certainly it has a lot of support from economists, and I'm glad that you mentioned it. So we'll stop here. I'll say thank you to the viewers for hearing Professor Jha at length. I'll see you in the next round or next video with another guest. Till then, bye.